Under the soft gold haze of sunset, table 12 still held two quiet truths, a full glass of untouched wine and a wedding ring placed precisely at its edge. No name card, no guests gathered near, only silence surrounded the table like dust in the aftermath of an unspoken storm. From across the lawn, where laughter flowed as easily as champagne, Peter finally looked over. His eyes paused on the scene, not with panic or guilt, but with a vacant awareness, as if recognizing something had been lost long before tonight. Sarah, standing beside him, turned away quickly, her smile to the investor next to her faltering just slightly. She didn't glance back. She didn't need to. The weight of Margaret's absence was heavier than her presence had ever been. And yet, Margaret had never walked with more grace. Moments earlier, she had stood from her chair with a calm that unnerved the most powerful people in the room. No dramatic gestures. No tears. Just one steady breath, the sound of her heels whispering over gravel as she left everything behind, everything but herself. The sapphire dress she wore moved with a quiet dignity. It wasn't new, but it had waited. Waited like her silence. Like her strength. Like the truth she had carried for years, folded carefully into the seams of her resolve. She didn't turn back. Not when the wind stirred the lanterns above. Not when servers whispered uncertainly about clearing the wine and the ring. Not when Peter took a single step in her direction and stopped, as if the courage had evaporated before it could reach his feet. She simply walked through the open gate, into the twilight, into a space that did not ask her to explain why she had stayed so long, or why she had finally left. Because the story was not theirs to narrate anymore. It belonged to her now. And her story had always been more than the company they built, the name they shared, or the betrayals that tried to define her. It was the story of a woman who remembered herself. That morning, before the party, Margaret had stood at her vanity, fastening a single pearl earring. The room was still. Her reflection had stared back, not asking for beauty, but for proof of survival. She saw it there, in the lines on her face, in the steady hand that clasped the earring, in the slight curve of her mouth that no longer needed to smile to know its worth. She had opened her drawer and lifted the old photograph, the one of her and Peter in front of Albright and Company 20 years ago. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She simply placed it face down. Not discarded, not destroyed, just no longer dictating the narrative. That same photograph would later return to her at the party, carried by the smallest hands, those of a little girl named Mia, who said she found it under a printer. Margaret had thanked her gently, her voice barely above a whisper. And when Mia asked if it was true, that she had once saved the whole company, Margaret didn't answer. She didn't have to. Because her silence carried more truth than any applause that evening. Now, as the lawn glimmered behind her, Margaret stepped into a taxi waiting quietly at the curb. She didn't give directions. The driver knew where she was going. She had made that reservation weeks ago, not at a hotel, not at an estate, but at a small lakeside inn with no internet, no press, no agenda. Just room 14, where a typewriter waited beside a window that looked out onto the water. Where she could write, not about what had happened, but about what could still be built. Back at the event, the server hesitated by table 12. The wine still shimmered dark in its glass. The ring, a delicate circle of commitment once full of promise, now lay quiet, untethered. He reached for both, paused, then left them exactly where they were. Some things, he thought, aren't meant to be cleared away so easily. In the days that followed, Margaret received no calls from Peter. No letters from Sarah. Only a small envelope arrived in the mail from a return address she didn't recognize. Inside was a note, unsigned, that read, "You left more than silence. You left proof that integrity still has a place here." She folded it and tucked it beside her new company charter. The one she was writing not for Albright and Company, but for the team she was quietly gathering, those once called outdated, dismissed, or irrelevant. Margaret had walked away from the company. But not from her values. And in that walk, silent, steady, dignified, she had reclaimed something far greater than shares, titles, or speeches. She had reclaimed herself. She had walked out alone. But not empty. 9 years earlier, before the ring was ever removed and before the name Margaret became something spoken only in past tense within boardrooms, there was a different version of her. Not yet a symbol of strength. Not yet the woman left behind. Back then, she was simply a wife holding her husband's hand outside the glass doors of Albright & Company, smiling for a camera that caught her in the moment she still believed loyalty and love could build empires. The photo hung above her desk for years. It was the first thing she looked at each morning and the last thing her eyes met before sleep claimed her body at night. Peter had insisted on framing it. Proof of where we started, he'd said with that soft chuckle that always made her lower her guard. So we'll never forget what this was built on. But the forgetting didn't come all at once. It crept in slowly. A late night here. A missed breakfast there. A growing silence in the way he walked past her in the halls, no longer brushing her shoulder. She had chalked it up to stress. To pressure. To being human. Because Margaret, even in her sharpest calculations, still believed in giving grace. She hadn't yet learned that some people see grace not as a gift, but as a gap they can exploit. The beginning of the end started in a hotel conference room during a merger negotiation. Peter had flown to Milan, but the documents had arrived and signed. She stayed up that night revising them line by line, reaching out to every partner, every reluctant investor who had backed out because Peter had promised them too much. She salvaged the deal through sheer will and diplomacy. When Peter returned, he kissed her cheek and whispered, "I knew you'd fix it." She hadn't asked why he was unreachable for 48 hours. That same week, Sarah joined the team. Recommended by one of the board members, Sarah had a resume as polished as her wardrobe, degrees from Ivy League schools, years at strategic firms. Peter called her a godsend. Margaret called her an asset. But something in Sarah's smile felt rehearsed. Too symmetrical. Too practiced. And yet, Margaret welcomed her. Mentored her. Shared late nights in the office over cold takeout and quarterly reports. They laughed about absurd emails. They toasted over a signed deal with cheap wine. Margaret never noticed that Sarah never drank. The friendship was real, for a while. Or maybe it only felt real because Margaret needed it to be. As the company grew, so did Sarah's influence. Investors listened when she spoke. Peter deferred to her ideas. Margaret didn't fight it. "Let them shine," she often said. "There's room at the top for all of us." She still believed that then. But there were moments, fleeting, strange, and subtle, that hinted at something deeper. The way Sarah once adjusted Peter's tie before a gala, her fingers lingering just too long. The shared look they gave each other when Margaret brought up restructuring during a board meeting. She dismissed it. She had to. The alternative meant questioning everything. Then came the night of the anniversary gala. 25 years of Albright & Company. Margaret wore the same navy blue dress from their 10th, slightly tailored, but still hers. She gave a speech that made even the coldest shareholders tear up. Peter didn't stand with her on stage. He stood with Sarah, clinking glasses with someone from marketing. When asked why, he said, "Sarah's been leading our growth wing, makes sense she represents it." Margaret smiled. But something inside her turned to glass. It was that same night she went back to the office alone. Everyone else was still at the afterparty. The elevator ride up was silent except for the low buzz of champagne in her veins. She hadn't planned to work. She just didn't want to go home to an empty penthouse. Not again. The office was dim. She sat down, opened her drawer, and pulled out the photo. They had looked so young, so certain. So together. But time is a cruel mirror. It reflects more than just aging skin, it shows what you no longer have the courage to say out loud. Margaret placed the photo down and noticed something strange. Sarah's planner left open on her desk, pages splayed with highlighted notations, underlined numbers, sticky notes with phrases like, dividend split by Q3, and, he'll say yes if M signs first. The handwriting was familiar. Not because she'd seen Sarah write it before, but because she had seen Peter mimic those very loops and slants whenever he needed to sign quickly. Her stomach turned. She wasn't sure why. Not yet. But something had shifted in the air. She stayed the whole night rereading contract drafts. Comparing signatures. Making notes. By dawn, she had her answer. Peter hadn't just lied about financials. He had legally transferred temporary operational control to Sarah under the guise of strategic transition. Documents she had trusted Sarah to draft for review had already been filed. She wasn't out of the company, but her vote had been diluted. Discreetly. Systematically. And worst of all, she had signed them. The betrayal wasn't a knife, it was a slow bleed. She didn't cry that morning. She dressed. Applied makeup. And when Peter arrived hours later with coffee and a casual, "Did you sleep here again?" she smiled. And said yes. That night, she began documenting everything. Sarah's emails. Peter's meetings. Expense reports that suddenly included hotel stays and client dinners that didn't match any calendar. Margaret said nothing. Not yet. She needed proof, not emotion. She wasn't going to win by breaking down. She would win the way she always had, by staying. Weeks passed. Margaret attended meetings, nodded in boardrooms, approved budget reallocations. Her hand didn't shake. Her eyes didn't narrow. But her silence was no longer the silence of endurance. It was the silence of gathering power. Until one morning, in the middle of finalizing a quarterly update, a folder dropped from her desk. It slid open and out came a photograph, one she hadn't seen before. Peter and Sarah. Hand in hand. Smiling at a beach resort in Florence. The timestamp on the back said, Milan Strategy Conference. The same one Peter hadn't signed the merger from. The same one she saved for him. She stared at the photo for a long time. Not because it surprised her. But because it confirmed everything she had refused to name. She folded it, tucked it into her notebook, and exhaled. That was the moment Margaret disappeared. And the woman who rose in her place was someone else entirely. Someone not to be betrayed again. Margaret didn't confront them. Not at first. That would have been too easy. Too loud. And Margaret had never been one to scream when silence could be sharper than any blade. Instead, she returned to the office the next day as if nothing had changed. She nodded at Peter's assistant. She complimented Sarah's shoes. She poured herself coffee and sat down to finish a spreadsheet on international logistics that no one else understood but everyone depended on. That was the thing about being underestimated. People forgot how often you carried the whole foundation beneath their feet. It wasn't revenge Margaret sought. It was clarity. It was restoration. It was justice, but not the kind you could serve with public humiliation or scandal. She didn't want them to fall. She wanted to rise, and not just back to where she was, but beyond it. To a place they had never let her reach. And for that, she needed to take back what had been quietly stolen in ink and signatures disguised as favor. She began quietly reviewing every shareholder agreement, every clause Sarah had ever suggested, just for protection, every vote proxy Peter had ever assigned during the merger era. There were patterns. Discrepancies. Silent names with small percentages scattered across distant holdings, people she'd once known, once mentored, once trusted. People pushed out gently or bought out just below threshold. But their names were still there. And a small stake was still a stake. So Margaret called them. Not to persuade. Not to guilt. She just told them the truth. Over tea in old cafes and beside their hospital beds. On rainy evenings and in dusty law offices. She recounted the story of how Albright and Company had started with a borrowed office space and a shared desk. How she once typed Peter's first proposal with her own hands while he paced in nervous circles. How they chose the company logo together, arguing for hours about whether to go with navy blue or gray. We wanted it to feel like trust, she said. Back then, that's what we were building. Most didn't need more than that. They remembered. And those who didn't remember still recognized something honest in the way she spoke. In the way she refused to make herself a victim, even when she could have. She didn't ask for loyalty. She asked for fairness. And she offered more than what their shares were worth, not because she had to, but because dignity, she believed, was part of the new structure. Each agreement was signed quietly. No announcements. No press. No scandal. Just silent ink and return trust. And within 6 months, Margaret held controlling interest in the very company she had once co-founded, and been nearly erased from. She waited until the quarterly shareholder meeting. She arrived precisely on time, her entrance unnoticed by most until the room stilled and heads began to turn. She didn't wear anything flashy. Just a simple cream-colored suit. A blue ink pen in her hand. A file tucked beneath her arm like any other day in the office. She took her seat near the center. Peter's eyes narrowed. Sarah stiffened. Then Margaret stood. Her voice didn't shake. Her tone didn't rise. She read calmly from the updated operational charter. Quoted the clauses. Cited the vote. And ended with one line that no one in the room forgot. I'm not here to tear anything down. I'm here to build something we don't have to lie to keep standing. Peter opened his mouth, but she stopped him with a single gesture. Please, she said softly, don't make this harder than it needs to be. You and I both know how this started. Only one of us forgot where it was supposed to go. No one interrupted her again. That night, the office was quiet again. The same glow of the desk lamp cast a tired light across the floor, like it always had. Margaret sat alone, reviewing notes not for the company, but for the team she was already hiring. Not polished executives. Not power brokers. Just people. People who had been left behind. People who still believed in good work and honest pay. People who reminded her of herself, long before any of this began. It was then that she opened the drawer and pulled out the photo again. The one of her and Peter, 20 years ago. She looked at it for a long time. She didn't smile. She didn't tear up. She just looked. Then she flipped it over. On the back, in faded marker, it read, "We did it." She took out a pen, and in her neat, quiet handwriting, added 2 more words, "I did." The next day, Sarah called. The number flashed on her screen. Margaret didn't flinch. She answered with a calm, "Hello," and waited. Sarah didn't apologize. Not really. She said things like, "I didn't mean for it to happen like this," and, "Peter was confused," and, "I just wanted to help." But Margaret didn't interrupt. She didn't argue. She just listened, the way someone listens to a storm fading in the distance. Finally, Sarah said, "So what now? You're just going to push us out?" Margaret looked out the window at the early morning sun breaking through the gray. "You pushed yourselves out the moment you thought I wouldn't notice," she said. "I'm just stepping into the space you left behind." There was silence on the line. And then, like a curtain falling, Sarah hung up. That was the last time they spoke. Weeks passed. Margaret moved her office into a smaller room. No corner view. No massive desk. Just a round table, 2 chairs, and a row of small potted plants she watered herself every morning. She wanted the air to be different. Wanted people to walk in and feel seen. Not assessed. She hired slowly. Not by resume, but by conversation. A former secretary who had been let go for not adapting fast enough. A warehouse manager who once drove her to meetings when no one else could. A woman who had taken 5 years off to care for her mother and thought no one would hire her again. Margaret hired them all. And they rebuilt the company in a way that felt human again. And then, one afternoon, she walked past the glass conference room and paused. Peter was inside. He wasn't supposed to be. But someone had let him in. He sat in the seat he used to claim. Looking out over the city. He didn't move when he saw her reflection. Didn't stand. Just turned slowly and met her gaze. "I didn't think you'd come back," he said, voice lower than she remembered. Margaret didn't enter. She stood just outside, hand resting on the doorframe. "I never left," she said quietly. "You just stopped looking." He stood, walked over, stopped inches from the glass. "I made a mistake. I know. I miss what we had." Margaret smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "So do I," she said. "But I miss who I was more. And I had to lose you to find her again." She turned. Walked away. No anger. No bitterness. Just the soft resolve of someone who had rebuilt herself from the ground up. And behind her, the glass door closed with a whisper. Not a bang. Because endings don't always have to echo. Sometimes, the quietest ones are the most permanent. Now prepare yourself, because what Margaret does next, no one saw coming. It was raining the morning Margaret received the letter. Not an email. Not a text. An actual envelope, cream-colored and thick with embossed edges. The kind that used to arrive before everything became fast, cold, and easy to erase. It was waiting on her doorstep, resting against the doormat like a secret too heavy to be kept any longer. She stood staring at it, her fingers trembling not from fear, but from something older, something deeper. Recognition. Inside, the letter was handwritten in a script she hadn't seen in years. Not Peter's. Not Sarah's. It was from the daughter of the man who had once been their mentor. The man who gave them their first investment, their first chance. The man who had died long before any betrayal, long before the word corporate became a weapon. His daughter wrote of how she'd seen the board's restructuring. How the whispers had reached her even from the quiet vineyard where she now lived. She had heard how Margaret had returned, not to destroy, but to restore. And she wanted to help. Enclosed was a single document, a minor shareholder's certificate, long lost in legal limbo, now signed over entirely to Margaret. It wasn't the value that made Margaret's breath catch. It was the final line of the letter, "My father always said you were the soul of that company." It's time the soul took the reins again. Margaret folded the paper slowly, with reverence. Then she placed it on her desk beside the last page of her new strategic charter. One final signature would seal it. Hers. The one name no one could erase now. She picked up her pen. Signed. And quietly exhaled. That same afternoon, she hosted the first all-staff meeting under the new leadership. Not in the main boardroom with its sterile glass and echoing ego, but in the old accounting room, where light filtered softly through frosted windows and the chairs didn't match. People came slowly, uncertain at first. Some brought notebooks. Some brought nothing but their presence. All brought questions. Margaret didn't give a speech. She sat on the edge of a low table, legs crossed, hair swept back without fuss, and simply said, "We're going to rebuild." Not the brand. Not the image. The heart. Someone asked if there would be layoffs. Another if they were being acquired. Margaret shook her head. "No more surprises," she said. "Only choices. You can stay and help build something real, or you can go with respect and support. Either way, no one will be discarded in silence again." And no one left. The next few weeks passed in a blur of slow progress and quiet triumphs. Desks were rearranged to face each other. Doors were left open. Margaret started eating in the staff lounge instead of the executive dining room. People spoke more. Smiled more. Some even cried, usually out of relief. But not everything was easy. One evening, she walked past the conference room and saw Sarah sitting alone at the table. She had returned to collect some old documents. Legally, she had no further stake in the company. But emotionally, her shadow still lingered. Sarah looked up. "You're really doing it," she said softly. Margaret paused. "Not alone." Sarah nodded, brushing her fingers along the edge of the table. "I used to think power was the ability to take anything," she whispered. "Turns out, it's knowing when you've taken too much." Margaret said nothing. Sarah stood, collected her things, and walked out. She didn't say goodbye. And Margaret didn't watch her leave. That night, she returned to her modest apartment, downsized long ago when she decided she didn't want marble floors or panoramic city views to define her. She brewed tea, sat by the window, and opened the drawer where she'd kept a small bundle of letters she once wrote and never sent. Letters to Peter. To Sarah. To her younger self. To the woman she had almost become. She didn't read them. She didn't need to. She took a match, struck it against the box, and lit a single candle instead. Then, one by one, she placed the letters into the flame. Not with hatred. Not with grief. But with release. The ashes curled and vanished, taking old words with them. Making space for new ones. Days later, a young woman knocked on her door. Not a lawyer. Not a journalist. Just a girl with wide eyes and trembling hands. Her name was Elise. She had once applied for an internship at Albright & Company but never made it past the screening stage. Margaret invited her in. "I don't know why I came," Elise admitted. "I guess. I just needed to see if you were real." Margaret smiled gently. "Sit down," she said. "Tell me who you are, not what you do. Just, who you are." And Elise did. It became a ritual. Every Friday, someone new walked into that office. Not for a job. Not for a contract. But for a conversation. A recommitment to the kind of work Margaret now believed in, the work of remembering each other. Then came the invitation. An industry summit. International. Prestigious. Margaret's name was on the keynote list, right under the CEO of a major tech firm and a media mogul. The email subject read, "We want to hear your story." She almost didn't go. But she thought of Mia, the little girl who once handed her a photograph, who once believed in her without knowing her. She thought of the new team. Of Elise. Of the people who had been told too often they were too old, too slow, too late. She owed it to them to show up. So she did. Her speech wasn't scripted. No bullet points. No slides. Just a microphone and a room full of people waiting to be told how to succeed. Instead, she told them how she failed. How she was forgotten. How she survived. And then she ended with this. "People say I saved my husband's company. But the truth is, I lost more than I saved. I gave up my name, my voice, my place. And still, I would do it again. Not for him. Not for revenge. But because saving something good, even when it breaks you, is never wasted." There was no applause. Not at first. Just stillness. And in that stillness, respect. A different kind of applause, born not from entertainment, but recognition. She returned home that night, tired but full. Full in a way no board seat or bonus could ever fill. At her door was another letter. This time, from Peter. A simple envelope. Inside, a photograph. It was the old one. Of the two of them. Smiling. Younger. With one small addition, in Peter's handwriting, a note on the back. You did it. And I see you now. She placed it in the drawer. Not as a trophy, but as a record of how far she'd come. And then she turned off the light. Outside, the rain had stopped. But inside her, something beautiful had only just begun.